He stood in the East Room of the White House, a towering figure with a lion's mane of hair, as President Abraham Lincoln raised his voice above the crowd. "Here comes my friend Douglass." The most powerful man in America sought his opinion, valued his counsel, called him friend. 27 years earlier, this same man had crouched naked in the cold, his feet split open by frost so deep you could slide a pen into the cracks. A piece of property, a brute, an animal fed on cornmeal and beatings. How does a whipped slave boy become a president's advisor? The answer is written in blood, printed in stolen ink, and forged in a 2-hour brawl in the mud. This is the story of a man who had to kill himself to be born. The child had no name that mattered. He was born Frederick Augustus Washington Bailey on a Maryland plantation, but those words meant nothing. Slaves didn't need names, not real ones. They needed backs strong enough to bend and voices quiet enough to forget. The boy learned early that the world was divided into those who spoke and those who bled, and he was born into the bleeding class. The White House plantation stretched across Talbot County like a feudal kingdom, a totalitarian machine designed to extract labor and crush hope. It wasn't a farm. It was a government, complete with overseers, hierarchies, and the constant threat of violence that kept the machinery running. For young Frederick, this world was defined not by what he had, but by what was deliberately withheld. The architecture of slavery wasn't just physical chains. It was calculated deprivation, a starvation of body and soul designed to produce obedience. Every month, the enslaved adults received their rations: 8 pounds of pork, often spoiled and rank with rot, and 1 bushel of cornmeal. That was it. No vegetables, no fruit, no variety. Just enough calories to keep muscles moving, but never enough to build strength or hope. Children who couldn't yet work the fields received even less. Frederick's entire wardrobe consisted of 2 coarse linen shirts per year. No shoes, no stockings, no jacket, no trousers. When the shirts disintegrated, which they did quickly under the Maryland elements, the children went naked. He remembers standing in winter, his feet pressed against frozen clay, the skin cracking open in deep fissures. The cold bit into his flesh like teeth. At night, he would crawl into a cloth bag used for carrying corn and sleep in a closet, his body curled against itself for warmth that never came. But the cold and hunger were just the baseline. They were the weather of slavery. The true violence, the kind that carved itself into memory and refused to fade, came in moments of spectacle. He was perhaps 7 years old, small enough to hide, when he witnessed the event he would later call the blood-stained gate, the entrance to the hell of slavery. His Aunt Hester was a woman of remarkable beauty, and beauty under slavery was a curse. It made you visible. It made you wanted. Captain Aaron Anthony, the man who owned Frederick and likely fathered him, had become obsessed with her. He had commanded her to stay away from a young man named Ned, another slave who dared to court her. Hester disobeyed. Autonomy, even in love, was an unforgivable rebellion. Frederick watched from a closet, peering through a crack in the wood, as Captain Anthony dragged Hester into the kitchen. He tore her clothing from her body, exposing her shoulders and back, stripping away her dignity along with the fabric. He tied her hands to a hook in the ceiling joist, pulling the rope until she stood on the tips of her toes, suspended and helpless, her body stretched into a posture of forced submission. Then he picked up the cowskin whip. The sound came first, the swish of leather cutting through air, then the wet thud of impact against flesh. Hester screamed, a sound so raw and primal it seemed to tear through the walls. Anthony cursed, his voice thick with rage and something darker, something possessive and sexual. The whip fell again, and again. Warm red blood began to drip onto the kitchen floor, pooling in the spaces between the boards. Frederick watched it all, frozen, unable to look away and unable to intervene. He was learning the fundamental lesson of his existence. Under slavery, a woman's beauty could be her death sentence, a man's jealousy could be law, and a child's witness meant nothing. This was not just violence. This was pedagogy. The whipping of Aunt Hester taught Frederick that his body was not his own, that pain could arrive without warning, and that the people who claimed to own him could destroy anyone he loved. It taught him that slavery was not merely an economic system, but a form of sexual and psychological terrorism. And it taught him, though he could not yet articulate it, that he would either escape this hell or be consumed by it. He also learned he was fatherless and motherless in any way that mattered. The whisper followed him through childhood. Your master is your father. If true, it meant the man who whipped Aunt Hester, who ruled with fists and cowskin, had also forced himself on Frederick's mother, Harriet Bailey. She was a ghost in his life, a field hand stationed on a distant farm 12 miles away. She visited him only at night, walking the distance after a full day of labor, lying beside him in the dark as he slept, and leaving before dawn to avoid the whip. He saw her perhaps 4 or 5 times in his entire childhood, always in shadow, never in daylight. When she died, he was 7. He felt nothing, or told himself he felt nothing, because how do you mourn a woman you never knew? The system had designed this severance. Slavery destroyed the family to ensure there was no inheritance, no lineage, no identity beyond the auction block. He was raised by his grandmother, Betsy Bailey, a woman of skill and survival, a gardener and fisherwoman who taught him the rudiments of endurance. But even that bond was severed. One day, without warning, she walked him through the woods to the main plantation and left him there, disappearing back down the path. He stood sobbing, abandoned again, another lesson in impermanence. This was the abyss. Cold feet and stolen food and the taste of blood in the air. Frederick Bailey was being forged in deprivation, and every crack in his skin, every lash he witnessed, every night he shivered in that corn sack, was teaching him a singular truth. The world was built to break him, and if he wanted to survive, he would have to become unbreakable. At age 8, Frederick was sent to Baltimore, and the world cracked open. The city was a different kind of cage, one with wider bars and stranger rules. He was assigned to serve Hugh and Sophia Auld, a shipbuilder and his wife, and for the first time in his life, he encountered something he had never seen before, a white woman who treated him like a human being. Sophia Auld had never owned a slave before. She hadn't yet learned the posture of domination, the performance of cruelty that slavery required of its white participants. She spoke to Frederick kindly. She smiled at him. And most dangerously of all, she began teaching him to read. She sat him down with a spelling book and guided him through the alphabet as if it were the most natural thing in the world, as if literacy were a right and not a weapon. Then Hugh Auld discovered what his wife was doing, and the world snapped shut again. Frederick was in the room when Hugh delivered his verdict. If you teach that nigger how to read, there will be no keeping him, Hugh said, his voice cold with certainty. It would forever unfit him to be a slave. He would become unmanageable and of no value to his master. As to himself, it could do him no good, but a great deal of harm. It would make him discontented and unhappy. Frederick listened to these words as if they were a revelation from God. In trying to forbid literacy, Hugh Auld had accidentally revealed the entire architecture of slavery. The system wasn't held together by chains alone, but by ignorance. Keep the slave illiterate, and you keep him enslaved. Teach him to read, and you give him the tools to imagine freedom, to articulate his condition, to name his oppression. Frederick realized in that moment that literacy was the pathway from slavery to freedom, and Hugh Auld had just handed him the map. Sophia transformed after her husband's edict. Slavery requires a hardness of heart, and she had been too soft. Under Hugh's influence, she became something else entirely. The woman who had smiled at Frederick now watched him with suspicion. If she saw him with a newspaper, she would snatch it away with a face twisted by anger. If she caught him with a book, she would chase him through the house. Slavery, Frederick observed, was corrupting her as much as it oppressed him. It was turning a tender-hearted woman into a tyrant, forcing her to participate in a system that destroyed the humanity of everyone it touched, master and slave alike. But the spark had been lit, and Frederick refused to let it die. If Sophia would no longer teach him, he would teach himself. He turned Baltimore into his classroom, and the city's white children into his unwitting instructors. The strategy was simple, but required cunning. Frederick worked in the old household, and he had access to bread, that precious currency of the poor. When he was sent on errands through the streets of Baltimore, he carried extra bread in his pockets. He sought out the white children of the slums, the hungry boys with dirty faces and empty stomachs, and he made them an offer. Bread for knowledge. He would share his food if they would share their lessons. The transaction was illegal on both sides. He was a slave stealing food and pursuing forbidden knowledge. They were poor whites helping a black boy rise above his station. But hunger and curiosity made allies of them, and in the alleys and doorways of Baltimore, Frederick Bailey learned to read. He devoured every scrap of text he could find, newspapers left on benches, discarded handbills, the sides of buildings. He worked in the Durgan and Bailey shipyard, and there he discovered another form of literacy, the industrial code. Carpenters marking timber for ship construction used abbreviations. L for larboard, the left side of the ship. S for starboard, the right. LF for larboard forward. SA for starboard aft. Frederick memorized these letters, traced them with his finger, then began practicing them himself. He found a lump of chalk and turned the city into his notebook, writing on fences, brick walls, and pavements. He was literally writing himself into existence, marking his presence on a world that insisted he didn't matter. He also found a book, a collection of speeches titled The Columbian Orator, and it changed the course of his life. The book contained dialogues between masters and slaves, arguments for emancipation, defenses of liberty. It gave him language for the injustice he felt, but couldn't yet name. It taught him that slavery was not natural or inevitable, but a political choice, a system that could be argued against and dismantled. The words of those speeches became weapons in his mind, tools he would later wield from stages and podiums across the North. But literacy came with a cost. Hugh Auld had been right about one thing. Reading made Frederick discontented. The more he learned, the more he understood the enormity of his chains. Ignorance had been a kind of mercy, a fog that obscured the full horror of his condition. Knowledge burned that fog away and left him staring at the truth. He was a slave in a country that called itself free, a human being treated as property, a mind trapped in a system designed to crush it. He began to envy the ignorance of his fellow slaves, the ones who couldn't read and therefore couldn't fully comprehend their degradation. Learning to read had opened his eyes, but it had also opened a wound, and he wasn't sure the wound would ever heal. Still, he kept reading. He kept learning. Because even if knowledge brought pain, it also brought power. And power, he was beginning to understand, was the only way out. But literacy alone wouldn't free him. The real test was still ahead, and it would require not just intelligence, but physical courage. Frederick was about to learn that the journey from slave to free man required more than stolen books and whispered lessons. It required a willingness to fight, to risk death, and to stare down the men who claimed to own him. The boy who hid in the closet watching Aunt Hester's whipping was growing into someone else. Someone who refused to hide. Someone who would meet violence with violence and silence with a roar that would echo across a nation. At 16, Frederick was sent back to the countryside to a man named Edward Covey. Covey had a reputation, and it preceded him like a stench. They called him the slave breaker. Planters sent him their most rebellious slaves, the ones who had tasted too much freedom or learned too many words, and Covey would break them down, strip away their defiance, and return them as obedient laborers. He did this not through spectacular violence, but through relentless, grinding cruelty. He worked them past exhaustion. He appeared without warning, slipping through fields like a snake, earning his nickname, the Snake, for his sneakiness. He whipped them for small infractions and large ones, for mistakes and for existing. His goal was not punishment, but psychological destruction. Frederick arrived at Covey's farm still carrying the literacy and awareness he had gained in Baltimore, and Covey set about erasing it. The work was brutal. Frederick was sent into the fields to labor from dawn until long after dark, his hands bleeding, his body screaming for rest that never came. He had been raised in the city, had worked as a house servant, and his body was not conditioned for this kind of labor. Within days, his hands were raw. Within weeks, he was moving through the world in a haze of exhaustion and pain. Covey watched him constantly, waiting for him to fail. And when Frederick did fail, when he collapsed from heat stroke while working in the August sun, Covey responded with the whip. Frederick lay on the ground, barely conscious, and Covey kicked him in the side, demanding he stand. When he couldn't, Covey struck him in the head with a hickory stick, opening a wound that bled down his face. Frederick managed to stagger to his feet and stumble away, blood mixing with sweat, his vision blurred. He walked 7 miles through the woods to the house of his legal master, Thomas Auld, to beg for protection, or at least a reprieve. Auld listened to his story, saw the blood, and sent him back to Covey. There would be no rescue. There would be no mercy. Frederick returned to Covey's farm, knowing that something fundamental had shifted. He had asked the system for help, and the system had told him to accept his beating. He had looked for authority to intervene, and authority had shrugged. He was alone. And in that aloneness, a new resolve began to form. A few days later, Covey came for him again. It was early morning, and Frederick was in the stable tending to the horses. Covey entered quietly, hoping to catch him off guard, and lunged at him, trying to tie his legs with a rope to immobilize him for a whipping. But this time, Frederick didn't submit. This time, he fought back. He grabbed Covey by the throat. He seized him with both hands and held him there, locking eyes with the man who had tormented him for months. Covey was shocked. Slaves didn't do this. They didn't resist. They didn't fight. But Frederick wasn't asking for permission anymore. He was claiming his humanity by force. The fight lasted 2 hours. It wasn't a boxing match or a duel. It was a grapple, a wrestling match in the mud and manure of the stable. 2 men locked together in a struggle that was about far more than physical dominance. Covey tried to overpower him, but Frederick matched him, blow for blow, grip for grip. Covey called for help from another slave, a man named Bill, ordering him to assist. Bill looked at Covey, looked at Frederick, and refused. The system was cracking. The complicity that slavery required was breaking down, and in that moment, Covey was exposed as what he truly was, a coward who relied on fear and the support of others to maintain his power. They fought until Covey was exhausted, his face streaked with dirt and blood, his breath coming in ragged gasps. And then it was over. Covey let him go. He didn't call the authorities. He didn't have Frederick arrested or sold. He simply let it end, as if the fight had never happened. Frederick later understood why. To admit that a slave had bested him, had fought him to a standstill and walked away, would have destroyed Covey's reputation. The slave breaker couldn't afford to admit he had been broken. For Frederick, the fight was a resurrection. He described it in those exact terms: a glorious resurrection from the tomb of slavery to the heaven of freedom. He had been dead, psychologically speaking, crushed under the weight of Covey's cruelty, and he had fought his way back to life. Covey never whipped him again, never touched him again, and Frederick learned a lesson that would define the rest of his life. Power concedes nothing without a demand. If you want freedom, you have to be willing to fight for it, even if that fight costs you everything. But fighting Edward Covey wasn't the same as escaping slavery. Frederick was still trapped, still bound by law and custom to a life he hadn't chosen. He began planning his escape, but planning wasn't enough. He needed resources, he needed help, and he needed a disguise. In 1838, at age 20, Frederick made his move. He had met a free black woman named Anna Murray in Baltimore, a domestic worker who had saved her own money and earned her own freedom through years of labor. She loved him, and more importantly, she believed in him. Anna became his co-conspirator. She sold a feather bed to raise money for his train ticket. She sewed him a disguise, a red shirt, a tarpaulin hat, and a black scarf tied loosely around his neck, the costume of a sailor. Frederick had worked in the shipyards long enough to know the language of sailors, the jargon and slang that would help him pass inspection if questioned. The plan was audacious and fragile. Frederick would board a train in Baltimore bound for Philadelphia, traveling as a free black sailor. He borrowed protection papers from a retired sailor, documents that proved the bearer was a free man. The description on the papers didn't match Frederick. The man described was shorter, lighter-skinned, built differently. But Frederick gambled that the conductor wouldn't look too closely, that the confidence in his voice and the authenticity of his costume would be enough. He boarded the train. His heart hammered in his chest as the conductor approached, asking for his papers. Frederick handed them over with a steady hand, affecting a casual demeanor, as if he rode trains every day, as if freedom were his birthright and not a desperate theft. The conductor glanced at the papers, glanced at Frederick's face, and handed them back. He moved on. Frederick sat frozen in his seat, hardly daring to breathe. Every white face in the train car was a potential threat. Every stop was a chance to be discovered. He transferred to a ferry, then another train, moving through crowds where someone might recognize him, where a slave catcher might be waiting. But luck, preparation, and sheer audacity carried him through. On September 4th, 1838, he arrived in New York City. He was technically free, though legally still a fugitive. He stood on the streets of New York, a man remade, a slave who had stolen himself and walked into a new life. Anna joined him shortly after, and they married. She had financed his freedom. She had sewn his disguise. Without her, the great Frederick Douglass might have lived and died as Frederick Bailey, a slave in Maryland, his voice never heard beyond the fields where he labored. But Frederick had escaped. The boy who had hidden in the closet, the young man who had fought Covey in the mud, had walked out of slavery and into history. The whip marks on his back were still there. The memories of Aunt Hester's screams still echoed in his mind. But he was free. And now, the real work could begin. Freedom was not a destination. It was a new battlefield, and Frederick discovered that escaping slavery was only the first war. Now, he had to dismantle it, to convince a nation that the system it had built its wealth upon was an abomination, and the weapon he would use was his voice. Within 3 years of his escape, Frederick Douglass, as he now called himself, taking a new surname from a Walter Scott poem to obscure his identity, had become the most powerful orator in the abolitionist movement. When he spoke, rooms fell silent. When he testified about slavery, white audiences wept or raged or both. His voice was described as a rich baritone, organ-like and thunderous, capable of filling a tent with thousands of people in an era before microphones. He could whisper and make you lean forward. He could roar and make you step back. He wielded mimicry and sarcasm like weapons, shifting tones from fury to pathos, holding crowds in his palm. But it wasn't just his voice. It was his presence. Standing over 6 feet tall with a lion's mane of hair and a gaze that refused to look away, he commanded attention. He was deliberate about this. He refused to smile in photographs, refused to play the role of the grateful, submissive former slave that white audiences wanted. In every image, he stared directly into the camera with what observers called majestic wrath, challenging the viewer to see him as anything other than a man. He became the most photographed American of the 19th century, using the camera as a political tool to assert his humanity. His philosophy was confrontation. If there is no struggle, there is no progress, he declared. Power concedes nothing without a demand. It never did, and it never will. He believed in agitation, in making people uncomfortable, in refusing to let them look away from the horrors of slavery. He wasn't interested in polite conversation or gradual reform. He wanted thunder and lightning, not gentle showers. And then the Civil War came, and Frederick saw his chance. This wasn't just a war to preserve the Union. For him, it was a war to destroy slavery forever, to burn the system to the ground and salt the earth where it had stood. But he also saw an opportunity to prove something that white America had denied for centuries, that black men could be soldiers, citizens, heroes. When Massachusetts Governor John Andrew formed the 54th Massachusetts Regiment, the first official black combat unit in the Union Army, he asked Frederick to help recruit soldiers. Frederick threw himself into the effort with an intensity that bordered on desperation. He traveled from town to town, speaking to crowds of free black men in the North, telling them this was their moment. "Once let the black man get upon his person the brass letters U.S., he thundered. Let him get an eagle on his button and a musket on his shoulder and bullets in his pocket. There is no power on earth that can deny that he has earned the right to citizenship." But Frederick didn't just send other men's sons to war. He sent his own. Lewis Henry Douglass and Charles Ramond Douglass, his boys, were among the first to enlist. Lewis became a sergeant major. Frederick was risking everything he loved on a political gamble, betting that if black men fought and died for the Union, the nation would be forced to recognize their humanity. But the risk was almost unbearable. Black soldiers captured by Confederate forces weren't treated as prisoners of war. They were executed on the spot or sold back into slavery. Every day his sons were in uniform was a day Frederick had to live with the knowledge that they might be murdered for daring to fight. The government betrayed them. Black soldiers were paid $10 a month while white soldiers received $13. Black soldiers were denied commissions, barred from becoming officers no matter their merit or bravery. Frederick stopped recruiting. He refused to be complicit in a system that asked black men to die for a country that wouldn't pay them equally or respect them fully. He demanded a meeting with President Lincoln to address these injustices directly, and Lincoln, surprisingly, granted it. They met 3 times during the war, Frederick and Lincoln, and the relationship evolved from suspicion to respect. Frederick had initially criticized Lincoln as tardy, cold, dull, and indifferent on the question of emancipation, frustrated by the president's slowness to act. But over time, he came to see Lincoln as a man moving as fast as the politics of the moment would allow, a pragmatist trying to hold together a fractured nation while dismantling its original sin. Their final meeting came on the night of Lincoln's second inauguration in March 1865. Frederick attended the inaugural address earlier that day and had been moved by Lincoln's words, by the president's acknowledgement that slavery was the cause of the war and that its destruction was divine justice. That evening, Frederick attempted to enter the White House reception, a public event where citizens could greet the president. He walked to the door with confidence, but the police officer stationed there stopped him. No persons of color were allowed inside, they said. This was the rule. This had always been the rule. Frederick refused to leave. He had not escaped slavery, built a national reputation, and sent his sons to war only to be turned away at the door of his own government. He sent word to Lincoln that he was being barred entry. When Lincoln heard that Frederick Douglass was at the door, he ordered him admitted immediately. As Frederick entered the East Room, the crowd parted. Conversation stopped. People stared, some in shock, some in outrage, some in awe. And then Lincoln saw him. The president's face lit up, and he raised his voice so everyone in the room could hear. "Here comes my friend Douglass." He crossed the room to greet him, took his hand and asked, "What did you think of my inaugural address?" "There is no man in the country whose opinion I value more than yours," Frederick replied, his voice steady. "Mr. Lincoln, that was a sacred effort." In that moment, something fundamental broke in the architecture of American racism. A former slave, a man who had once been legal property, stood in the executive mansion as the equal of the president. He was not there as a servant or a curiosity. He was there as a peer, a critic, a friend. The color line had been crossed, and it could never be fully restored. But victory came with costs Frederick hadn't anticipated. His marriage to Anna, the woman who had financed his escape and sewn his sailor disguise, had become a source of private pain. Anna was illiterate, dark-skinned, and domestic in a way that Frederick's new life of intellectual elites and European lecture tours left little room for. She stayed home in Rochester, managing the household, raising their 5 children, and operating an underground railroad station while Frederick traveled the country. Colleagues mocked her, called her too stupid for him, criticized her darker complexion. Frederick didn't defend her publicly. He had other companions now. Women who could discuss philosophy and politics. Women like Julia Griffiths, a white Englishwoman who lived in the Douglass home and helped save his newspaper from financial collapse, fueling rumors and Anna's resentment. And then there was Ottilie Assing, the German Jewish intellectual who interviewed Frederick in 1856 and never truly left. She spent summers at his home for 22 years, ostensibly helping with his work. But they were lovers, bound by an intimacy Anna could never provide. Assing loathed Anna, referred to her in letters as a border state, a piece of furniture, an obstacle to Frederick's full potential. She waited decades for Anna to die, certain that she and Frederick would then marry. Frederick had fought for freedom, had demanded equality, had risked his sons for citizenship. But he had also built his freedom on the erasure of the woman who had made it possible. Anna died in 1882, and Assing waited for the proposal that never came. Instead, Frederick married Helen Pitts, a white abolitionist 20 years his junior. Devastated, Assing returned to Paris. In August 1884, in the Bois de Boulogne, she swallowed potassium cyanide and ended her life. The letters she had written over 22 years were burned, her devotion erased. Frederick's second marriage ignited a scandal that threatened everything he had built. His children stopped speaking to him. Black communities felt betrayed, seeing his choice as evidence that the great race leader ultimately wanted to be white. White society called it miscegenation, disgusting, unnatural. Frederick offered a simple defense. My first wife was the color of my mother, and my second wife the color of my father. He claimed the right to love across the color line, to be fully human in his choices. But the cost was isolation from his own children, and a legacy forever complicated by the women he had loved, used, and abandoned. This was the price of becoming a monument. The whipped slave boy had become an advisor to presidents, but he had also become a man who carried his own contradictions, his own cruelties, his own unhealed wounds. By 1877, Frederick Douglass had become something he never imagined as a child standing barefoot in the Maryland cold. A man with power. President Rutherford Hayes appointed him United States Marshal for the District of Columbia, making him the first black man to hold the position. The symbolism was staggering. A former fugitive slave now had the authority to arrest white citizens, to execute federal warrants, to represent the full weight of American law. Frederick walked into that role with a grim satisfaction, delighting in the irony of white men having to petition him for favors, having to acknowledge his authority, having to call him Marshal Douglass. But power also meant compromise, and compromise meant complicity. Before his appointment as marshal, he had been made president of the Freedmen's Savings and Trust Company, a bank created to help former slaves build wealth. When he first saw the bank's grand building, he felt, in his own words, like the Queen of Sheba when she saw the riches of Solomon. It seemed like a temple to black economic advancement, proof that freedom could mean more than just the absence of chains. But he had been brought in too late. The bank was already gutted, looted by white trustees who had used depositors' money for speculative investments. Frederick put $10,000 of his own money into the bank to inspire confidence, but it collapsed anyway. Thousands of former slaves lost their life savings, money they had scraped together from years of brutal labor. The failure haunted Frederick for the rest of his life. He had gone from agitator to bureaucrat, and in that transition, he had become entangled in the corruption of the very system he had once sought to destroy. That same year, Frederick made a journey that would define his complicated relationship with forgiveness and power. He returned to St. Michael's, Maryland, to visit Thomas Auld, one of his former masters, who was dying. The meeting was an emotional bookend to the whipping of Aunt Hester, the violence that had opened Frederick's consciousness decades earlier. Now he entered the room of a man who had once owned him, a man reduced by age and illness to a frail, weeping figure. Auld addressed him with respect. "Marshal Douglass." Frederick softened the formality, correcting him gently. "Not Marshal, but Frederick to you as formerly." They spoke as men, not as master and slave. Auld confessed, his voice breaking. "Frederick, I always knew you were too smart to be a slave. Had I been in your place, I should have done as you did." Frederick replied with a statement that carried both absolution and distance. "I did not run away from you, but from slavery." The visit was controversial. Younger black leaders felt Frederick was being too forgiving, that he was granting mercy to a man who had profited from human suffering. But for Frederick, this was the final victory. He had returned not as a victim seeking revenge, but as a superior granting mercy. He had proved that the slave and the master, in the end, were reduced to the same level by the approach of death. It was a philosophical triumph, but it was also a sign of how far he had drifted from the rawness of his earlier radicalism. That drift became a chasm in 1879 when thousands of black Southerners, terrorized by Jim Crow violence and the collapse of Reconstruction, fled to Kansas in what became known as the Exoduster movement. They were running for their lives, escaping lynch mobs and economic peonage, seeking any patch of land where they might be safe. Frederick opposed the exodus. He believed black people should stay in the South, that the federal government should protect them there, that leaving would forfeit their political power and numbers in the region. He called the exodus an ill-timed delusion. Younger leaders attacked him viciously. Richard T. Greener and others accused him of being out of touch, a wealthy northern bureaucrat who didn't have to face the lynch mobs, who didn't have to watch his children grow up under the constant threat of violence. "Douglass tells us to stay and fight," they said. "We say run and live." Frederick had become the voice of the establishment, and the next generation saw him as an obstacle rather than a leader. The radical who had once demanded immediate abolition was now counseling patience and endurance to people who had already endured too much. He lived long enough to see the dream of Reconstruction collapse entirely, to watch the South rebuild itself on a foundation of segregation and voter suppression, to witness the rise of a new system of racial control that looked disturbingly like the old one. He died on February 20th, 1895, after attending a women's rights meeting, still fighting, still speaking, but also aware that the world he had helped create was not the world he had imagined. He left behind an estate worth between $100,000 and $300,000, a fortune built on speaking fees, book sales, and government salaries. He owned Cedar Hill, a 15-acre estate in Washington, D.C., and properties in Rochester. He died wealthy, powerful, and famous. But his will sparked a bitter legal battle. He left the bulk of his liquid assets and Cedar Hill to Helen Pitts, his white wife. His children received the remainder. They challenged the will, fought over the technicalities, exposed the family's wounds in public. It was a messy, human end to a monumental life. The boy who had watched Aunt Hester's whipping from a closet had become a man who dined with presidents and owned mansions. The slave who had fought Edward Covey in the mud had become a marshal who commanded federal authority. The fugitive who had ridden a train in a sailor's disguise had become the most famous black man in America. But he had also become a man who erased his first wife's contributions, whose lover killed herself over his rejection, whose children contested his will, whose political positions alienated the next generation. Frederick Douglass was not a saint. He was a man who clawed his way out of hell and then had to figure out how to live in a world that still smelled like smoke. He made compromises. He hurt people who loved him. He aged into conservatism even as younger radicals took up the fight he had started. But he also proved something that the architects of slavery had insisted was impossible, that a black man could be brilliant, could be powerful, could stare down presidents and reshape a nation. His legacy is not the marble statue. It's the complexity. It's the recognition that liberation is not a single moment, but a lifetime of struggle, that freedom is not a gift, but a demand, and that the people who break chains often carry the scars of those chains forever. The whipped slave boy became a president's advisor, but he never stopped being the boy who had stood in the cold with cracked feet, who had hidden in a closet watching violence he couldn't stop, who had learned that survival meant fighting every single day. That fight didn't end with his death. It continued in every person who read his words, who heard his story, who understood that the system designed to break him had failed. Frederick Douglass lived and died as proof that you can steal yourself from the people who claim to own you, that you can turn pain into power, and that even if the world you build isn't perfect, it can still be better than the one you escaped. The blood-stained gate was real, but so was the man who walked through it and kept walking, all the way to the White House and beyond, carrying his scars and his contradictions, never forgetting where he came from, never forgiving the system that had tried to erase him.